Warning: what I'm about to show you involves heavy spoilers from the Godfather series. If you haven't seen these films, I highly recommend seeing them first before watching this video. I'm going to assume that everyone watching this is very familiar with the plot and events that happen in the Godfather movies. I consider The Godfather Part 1 and The Godfather Part 2 to both be my favorite films of all time. I put these movies, as well as Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away, and probably the Toy Story trilogy, in my number one spot. Now, I can make several videos and talk for hours about why I love these films so much, but in this video I'm only going to be focusing on the individual scenes that I like a lot. And there are actually a ton of terrific scenes spread throughout the first two movies. In fact, I don't think there's any movie with as many great scenes as just one Godfather movie has. I mean, actually, going back and looking, it's really amazing just how many great scenes there are. For both the first two films, nearly every single scene is terrific. So, it was really hard choosing just 10 scenes. I mean, it may not seem like it's that hard, but it actually was, considering, again, how many great scenes are in these movies. And I could easily make this video about, the 20 best scenes, or, maybe even 25. And every scene listed would be a good scene. But for this video, I'm just going to stick with 10. Now, these aren't necessarily the 10 best scenes, but they are my 10 favorite scenes. And I like these individual scenes for a number of different reasons, and I'll explain what I like about each scene when I get to them. But it really could be anything that makes it rank where it does. And I do think it's important to point out that this is my opinion, and due to this list is by no means definitive. I mean, heck, I may change my opinion later about the placement of a certain scene, and I may later wish that another scene was included that isn't right now. But that doesn't matter a whole lot, because every scene on this list, and the first 10 or so scenes that didn't make the cut, are truly magnificent scenes. And just because one scene isn't on the list doesn't make it doesn't take anything away from its greatness. These are my favorite movies of all time, after all. So of course I love just about everything in these two Godfather movies. And I even like Part 3, but there isn't any scene in Part 3 that's close to making this list. And with that being said, on to the list. Number 10. I'm Moe Greene. This scene from the original Godfather is where we really see for the first time just what kind of man Michael is as the new head of the family. That being a ruthless, fearless, and uncompromising Don. He goes to Las Vegas and flat out asks the most powerful man there what his terms are for his family's takeover of his empire. That man is Moe Greene, and his reaction, as well as the altercation that he and Michael get involved in, is one of the most memorable scenes I've ever seen in the movies. And the end of the scene, where Fredo tries to side with Moe Greene, shows just how genius and how much sense Fredo's story in the sequel was. And considering what happens later on, what Michael says to Fredo at the end of the scene is truly haunting. Number 9. The Murder of Don Fanucci. I only wanted to give a Vito murder one spot on this list, and it was a close call between the Fanucci murder and the murder of Don Ciccio, which was really more important in terms of the story and character arc of Vito. But I ultimately decided to go with Fanucci's murder. The build-up to it is so intense, and I just really like this one stylistically. And it's also a very important event in the story, since this is when Vito takes his first big step towards becoming the wise Don that we see in the first film. I mean, come on. This death is so awesome looking. Number 8. You're Nothing to Me Now. This scene in The Godfather Part 2 always gives me chills. I always joke that if there was a character in the first Godfather that felt underdeveloped, then The Godfather Part 2 makes up for it by developing them a lot. Fredo was always sort of in the background in the first film, but he's a major player in the second. And this scene, where Fredo addresses his feelings about what his family, and quite frankly, the audience, has been thinking about him, is truly a chilling scene. And it's thanks to this scene that Fredo goes from being a goofy background character to a major character who can be seen as a tragic figure. Number 7. It's Strictly Business. This scene from the original Godfather is great mainly because up to this point, Michael has just been a civilian. But once a cop breaks his jaw and the cheap tactic to kill his father pisses him off, he decides to get involved in the family business. It's great seeing these experienced mobsters struggle with what action to take, and then to see an inexperienced Michael devise a plan sort of on the fly. It's a crazy plan, but it's just crazy enough that it might work. I also really like Sonny's reaction when Michael proposes the plan, and after Sonny accuses Michael of taking the gang war personally, Michael says one of the most memorable lines in the film. Number 6. The Murders of Sollozzo and McCluskey. This is when Michael crosses the point of no return, as he murders the man who tried to assassinate his father, as well as the cop who guards him. It's this point that Michael becomes a true member of the Corleone crime family, and, like the Fanucci scene, The build-up to Michael actually pulling the trigger is incredible. It's a truly incredible scene and certainly deserves a spot on this list. Number 5. This is the business we've chosen. It was at this point in The Godfather Part 2 that I realized that I was watching a masterpiece. This scene brings the tragic story full circle. It isn't the furthest it progresses, but it's the first time I, at least, got a real sense of just how much pain has been caused by Michael's actions as the head of the Corleone family. And what's most amazing about this scene is that the pain I feel is the pain that is felt by the main antagonist, Hyman Roth. This scene, like the scene with Fredo, also shows just how closely related the events in Part 1 are to Part 2, and I also had a revelation while watching this scene. Hyman Roth is the bad guy because he actually gets emotionally attached to people and forms bonds with them, and because Michael killed his friend, who really didn't need to be killed, he wants to kill Michael. So the real bad guy is the man we've been behind up to this point, and the amazing thing about the series is that, as horrible as Michael is, I can't help but root for him to defeat his enemies. Number 4. The opening scene of the original Godfather. This is one of the most iconic and most parodied scenes in film history. But man, it is a great scene. Of course, it does a great job setting up the film's major themes and shows us some of the morality that lies at the heart of an immoral family. But I also like it most just because of how much darn fun it is to watch. And Marlon Brando is really the main reason. He is either my second or maybe my third favorite actor of all time, and his performance in this film is extraordinary. And what exactly is said in this scene is fun to listen to. I actually memorized the entire exchange between Vito and Bonacera. That's how much I enjoy this scene. And I could recite it to you right now, but I'm not going to get off topic here. And it was the perfect way to start a perfect movie. Number 3. It was an abortion. This scene, towards the end of The Godfather Part 2, is Michael's ultimate punishment for his crimes. And since we followed Michael and Kay's relationship for nearly 6 hours of film up to this point, watching their marriage fall apart the way it does is pretty brutal. And it only falls apart after Kay reveals that she aborted Michael's unborn child. This scene made my jaw drop like very few scenes have, and Michael's fury after hearing this just adds to the power of the scene. But you knew something had to give with all the sins that Michael had committed up to that point, and this was his ultimate punishment. The scene also worked because up to that point, anything that had happened to Michael, good or bad, Michael had been in control of. But this was the first time something terrible happened to him that he was powerless to stop, and this only added to the power of the scene. It is one of the most dramatic and most intense scenes I have ever seen. Number 2. The ending scene in The Godfather Part 2. When I first came up for the idea to make this list, this was actually what I had as number 1. It's one of, if not the most effective single scenes I've ever seen. I have to put the scene in context for you to understand why it works so well, although if you've seen The Godfather Part 2, I know I really don't need to. So, we've seen Michael change from a good-to-do civilian to a ruthless crime don, and so much has happened to him and the rest of the Corleones during the course of, these 2 movies, and that spans, a decade or so. So, when this scene shows up at the end of The Godfather Part 2, it's shockingly effective, because it shows us a glimpse of how things used to be, before certain characters die, and before the family completely falls apart. It was stunning when I realized that only 3 people in the entire scene are still alive at the end of the movie. And these aren't just typical film characters. These are characters I've really gotten attached to, and the scene has a lot of subtle action occur in it that sort of hinted at what was to come, like Fredo being blown off when he tries to express his opinion, and Michael joining the army so they can honor his country in World War II. And while Michael may have pride in his country, I think another reason he enlisted was to get as far away from his family and its activities as he possibly can, which we see in the first film is only delaying the inevitable. And after so much tragedy and so much death, this scene felt like a return to when things made sense in the film's universe. Every time I watch Part 2 and get to this scene, I breathe a sigh of relief because the family's back together and living happily. To see this scene results in a feeling that can only be understood by people who have seen both films, and I think it works just as well for them as it does for me. And the most haunting thing about it occurs at the end. The family goes into another room to greet Vito, while Michael ends up alone at the table. It's a sign of things to come. And just like that scene, Michael ends up alone. The reason he ends up alone in both the scene and the film while a bit different, are still related, and there's something in this scene that tells us a lot about Michael. But I'll wait for my eventual review of the movie to dive into it that much. And this scene gives The Godfather Part 2 quite possibly the greatest ending in film history. And like I said, you really have to see it for yourself to feel the impact. But it is unquestionably one of, if not, the greatest scene in movie history. Last but not least, number 1. The ending to The Godfather. As you can imagine, it would take a scene of godlike proportions to top the ending of The Godfather Part 2. And while I'm not sure this scene tops it, it comes close. And what made me pick it as number 1 was that this scene, in all honesty, is probably my favorite scene in any movie. You know, I went back and forth and I said, hold on a minute. Alright, this scene here, you know, I think, you know, I just thought that's got to be my favorite in any movie. So that's why it tops Part 2. And it's a scene that I never get tired of watching. And I'm sort of cheating by using 2 scenes here, those being the death of Carlo and the actual final scene. But the first one runs right into the second one, and the second scene only happens because of the first scene where Carlo dies. What can I say about this scene? Well, it's tense as hell. And the first time I watched it, I had no idea what was going to happen. But after knowing, it's amazing just how clever Michael is in this scene. He convinces Carlo that he won't be killed for betraying Sonny, and for a very legitimate reason, because he's married to Michael's sister Connie. And once he thinks that he's safe, Carlo goes from denying his role in Sonny's death to telling Michael exactly what he wanted to know. And then it turns out Michael was lying, and he has Carlo killed. Man, this type of manipulation is just fascinating to me, and I get into this scene every time I watch. Even though what Michael does is horrible, when I watch it, I feel like I'm in on a joke that Carlo didn't know about. And it might be bad, but I just find the whole scene fascinating and very powerful, what with Michael's sheer dominance and manipulation. And of course, I'm also glad that you get Carlo back for Sonny's death, who was one of my favorite characters. And then there's the final scene in the film, when Connie confronts Michael about the death of her husband. The scene is really emotional, but it becomes the stuff of legend at the end. Michael's wife asks him if he really did kill Carlo. Michael gets angry, not wanting his wife to ask about his business. Finally, he tells her she can ask him just this once about his business. She asks him once again, and Michael's response is just a single word: no. And that no hits you like a freight train. There isn't another single word line spoken in film as powerful as that no, at least not to me. I won't get into it now, but this scene is possibly the scene that sets up all the tragedy that would befall the Corleone family in the future. And the scene where the door closes on Kay does a great job of showing the life of the Don being a sealed secret system. It's very effective, and my favorite film scene of all time. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.